Hi, Roman world class. Welcome to my living room, where I am about to record for you the next exciting and thrilling episode of The Roman World, in which we consider the delicate question of how a reasonably functional representative democracy can devolve over time into an autocracy led by a hereditary monarch whose position is institutionalized and, oh, by the way, he's God now. This doesn't happen overnight. It's a process with many, many points along the way where you can interrupt and stop this from happening. Unless you want a God Emperor, in which case you just have to wait around long enough and one will inevitably show up. But he might behead you before that point, so just, FYI. Spoilers. This is the introduction to the timeline I'm going to be covering in the course of this lecture. And there was once a much more charming slide that included my baby and my cats and my spouse dancing around in the back of the slide when he got home from work. But alas, PowerPoint ate the slide. So god damn it, I'm going to tell you about this slide again. But for you, it's the first time. Just act surprised. Okay. This is a simple list of the civil wars, broadly defined, plaguing the Roman state over the course of the 1st century BCE. This is from about the year 100 down to about the year 28 BCE. About a century. An entire century if you include the Gracchi brothers, which I do, obviously. Folks, these aren't all the wars that Rome is fighting during the late Republic. These are the civil wars. So we're about to buckle up for some shit, right? This was a horrible time to be a Roman because choices made in the last century snowball into reigns of terror, plural, many civil wars, and in the middle of it all, the people who are dying and suffering are, as in most crises, the people least able to defend themselves. People being trafficked, people being displaced, people having their property taken from them, and also some important people with names that you'll recognize. I'm going to get into these in detail moving ahead, so I'm just going to give you the whirlwind tour of the highlights. Oh, hi, kitty. Hi, kitty. And Scipio is going to help me. Well, hey, you get a cat in this slide after all. Okay. We begin with the assassination of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, and it looks like there's not a lot happening between them and the social wars, but there is. Remember, this is when Marius repels the invasion of the Cimbri and the Teutones, beginning in around 107, 106 BCE, and continuing into the next century. This is also the time at which the power of the general is being created and coalescing around Marius. This brings us into the Social War. The Social War, I'll remind you, is the war that the Italian allies fight demanding their inclusion in Roman citizen rights. They lose, but they also get the citizen rights. So they lose, but they win. This, however, I'm defining as a civil war because, well, they get to be Roman citizens, so they count now. They're on the list. Great. This brings us to the conflict between Sulla and Marius. As I mentioned in the Marius lecture, the problem with making exceptions to rules because they happen to be really expedient right now is that those exceptions don't just go away. Exceptions create precedents, and once somebody has done it, somebody else can do it. This is what happens with Sulla. Marius is able to effectively take control of the state using a military emergency, a foreign war in his case, to get an unprecedented, I think it's 6 consulships in a row, and then there's another one here at the very end of his life. Sulla is Marius's brother-in-law, so he knows exactly how Marius did this more than anyone. They're married to a set of sisters, the Julia sisters. Their brother is Julius Caesar's father. Sulla, unlike Marius, though, is not a novus homo. He's not the first man in his family to be consul. His ancestors have been consuls, his family expected great things of him. But unlike Marius, he didn't initially have a lot of money. That money he made during his military career, in which he got the nickname Lucky Cornelius Sulla. More unpacking of that later. The next couple civil conflicts will tell you just how gosh darn lucky Sulla is, because when an opportunity to fight in a foreign war comes up, we've talked about Mithridates, this is the Mithridates incident, Sulla goes to war with Marius over which one of them gets to be in charge of the foreign war. Both of them want the glory, both of them want the political and social capital, and the literal capital. They want the money. Marius dies of natural causes in the middle of this conflict, and then Sulla leaves almost immediately to go take over the Mithridatic Wars, which is what he does. Sulla v. Marius is concluded by 87 BCE. Sulla goes, beats up Mithridates, returns to Rome, but by this point, Sertorius, who used to be one of Marius's lieutenants, has now become a military power in his own right. He effectively makes himself military dictator of a splinter Roman kingdom in Spain, and Sulla's sent to put that down. He wins. Then Marius has a son, Marius Jr. Sulla ends up going to war with him too. Now, this doesn't stop when Sulla's dead. After Sulla dies, he's created a good deal of resentment for reasons we're going to unpack in a future slide. At his funeral, on the field of Mars, that large field to the north of the city of Rome where the legions used to train and prepare, Sulla's body was being cremated, and a guy named Lepidus tries to shut that down and keep Sulla from being buried in honor. Rightly so, I think, because the thing that Sulla did to win so much anger was dismantle a bunch of citizen rights out of Roman law, and also to make a list of people he hated and then subsequently give people money for killing them. It's going to be one of those lectures. It's always one of these lectures in Roman world, isn't it? So Lepidus tries to interrupt and protest Sulla's funeral, and the mourners at Sulla's funeral beat him down and kill him. So even dead Sulla wins the last of the civil wars that Sulla is involved in. Lucky guy. Alas, that bell once rung is not unrung, because Sulla manages all of this because his loyal troops are willing to march on other Romans to do his bidding. And once this happens, there's the precedent. So for the rest of this century, everyone has in their mind, is this going to be Sulla Part 2? Is this going to be Sulla Part 2? Can I be Sulla Part 2? And this explains what ends up happening. We've only gotten through one generation of Romans as well. So just within this cohort, there have been, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-ish civil wars. We're not done yet. If you'd been wondering, well, why don't all of these enslaved, trafficked people who are now in Rome and outnumbering Romans, why don't they respond to their oppression with armed resistance? Well, they did. This isn't the only time either. Romans are constantly afraid that the people they've enslaved are going to turn on them and kill them. And sometimes they do. This is the most famous incident of the slave rebellions out of ancient Rome, that is Spartacus's rebellion. You've probably heard the name Spartacus, at least, somewhat familiar. More about him ahead. But the fact that this becomes a civil war, that the Roman legions have to be mustered and marched out against an army of enslaved people, and that the consuls, which Crassus and Pompey are, they're the consuls that year, are put in charge of this army, means that something has gone horribly off the rails. So the anxiety that's already quite high amongst elite Romans is at a fever pitch as we move into the next decade. We're now, let's see, from the social wars, we're really about 2 decades in by the time we get to the consulship of Cicero. I'm not going to say too much about this, although it's a really interesting moment. We're going to talk about it when we meet Cicero later. He's a prominent politician. He's from one of these new families. He's a novus homo, a person whose family members had never held office in Rome before. He's from one of these Italian city-states. During his consulship, he was under a lot of pressure internally from himself. He wanted to be famous very, very badly, but externally too, to really excel, to be special. And it is possible that he created this situation rather than just responding to it. But here's the most neutral version of this I can pitch to you. Cicero had an existing beef with the person that he beat to win his consulship position. That is a guy named Cataline. Cataline, unlike Cicero, was from one of these old wealthy Roman families. He expected to get elected, and he expected to get elected, interestingly, not on a pro-elite platform. He was running under a debt relief platform, which is why upper-class Romans were willing to vote for Cicero over Cataline. Cataline to them was a class traitor. Cicero, on the other hand, was one of these token new men who supported the traditional aristocracy and their rights and perceived privileges. This is a dynamic that happens a lot in circles that are bent on preserving elite privileges, but still allow a certain small percentage of people entry into that social world in order to give the illusion of upward mobility, while their policies are actively preserving and perpetrating inequality and a lack of enfranchisement. I'm being quite hard on the optimates, the powerful elites here, but quite frankly, I think they'll be fine. Lots of people like them. You can find lots of them on YouTube to listen to. This is my channel, and this is my class. And 1%ers irritate me. Not all of them. Some of them are very nice. I just think that nobody should die because they don't have money. That's fucked up. At any rate, Cataline allegedly, and I'm saying allegedly because the person alleging it is Cicero. In several speeches, they're very famous. You generally read them when you're learning to read Latin because they're easy to read, they're very interesting. Accuses Cataline of conspiring to overthrow the state, to burn down the city, and to abolish debt. Now, debt abolishment was scary to ancient Romans with money in the same way that abolishing student loans is threatening to modern people with money, in that there was a huge amount of investment capital tied up in this, and it was one of the biggest ways in which powerful people in this culture could control less powerful people. So abolishing debt for poor people in Rome would have meant the world. Just imagine your debts right now. If they're canceled, what could you do with your life? What choices could you make? What freedoms would you have to pursue things that you really want to do? This is a game changer, but it's also the kind of game changer that power structures work very hard to make sure doesn't happen, because so much depends on this tied up debt in an economy. So Cataline eventually is driven out of the city, according to Cicero, because he was up to nefarious things and planning to burn the city down. According to Cataline, Cicero just would not shut up, so he left to leave for the good of the state. This ends up, though, with Cataline joining a guy named Manelius, who was one of Sulla's ex-centurions. When Sulla dies, his army doesn't die. This is another problem that we start creating by making your general the patron of the army and having armies that are loyal to the man and not to the state, is that even after Sulla dies, Sulla's troops are feeling very entitled. They've been given huge land grants. They've had people kicked off of their own land in order that they can have a nice cozy existence. And Manlius and a band of Sulla's veterans are still going around the Italian countryside as raiders, essentially. They're using the stuff they learned as the Roman legion to then go out and increase their own bank accounts. Cataline joins with them, and Cicero with the consular army faces them on the field of battle. Cataline dies fighting, and he no longer controls the narrative. So all the word we have for how this conspiracy went down we have from Cicero. Cicero, however, in order to accomplish this moment, makes some choices that are going to end up creating some unfortunate precedents. Precedents that effectively end up informing the circumstances of his own death. He doesn't arrest Cataline. Cataline leaves the city, but the other alleged conspirators Cicero does arrest. He holds them without trial and then decides unilaterally to execute them without trial. You may remember one of the rights you get as a Roman citizen is the right to a trial before you're executed. We'll talk about this more when we talk about Cicero's complicated legacy. At any rate, we're only to the 60s. The crisis of the late Republic is not over. Caesar goes to civil war with Pompey in the early 40s. After that, the second triumvirate, more about who they are in a minute. These are the heirs of Caesar. So Caesar gets assassinated. I'm sure you're familiar. If you know anything about Caesar, you probably know that he gets stabbed to death on the Ides of March. Well, he gets stabbed to death on the Ides of March, but they don't stab everybody in Caesar's camp, just Caesar. So Caesar's allies sense an opportunity. They're also afraid for their life at this point, and so they end up going to war with Caesar's assassins, creating yet another civil war that occupies the mid to late 40s. Similarly, and you'll notice that there's some overlap here, the second triumvirate also goes to war with Pompey's son Sextus, because Pompey's family doesn't die entirely either. They kill Pompey, but his kids are still around, so that's happening. Then the second triumvirate starts going to war with each other. These are three Roman politicians who ally to avenge the death of Caesar, but like many very popular boy bands, they have problems. They don't like each other. They start fighting. And they all have their own armies. So when they fight, it turns into a civil war. And not just them with their armies, but also their wives have armies in this particular war. Marcus Antonius' wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius Antonius, both in Antony's name, but they may have been doing this on their own. Later, Antony argues that they didn't ask him first. They were just totally unilaterally using his army to have a civil war with. This is my skeptical face, just so you know. This finally leads us to the last gasp of the crisis of the late Republic, where Octavius and Antonius go directly to civil war with each other. Although if you ask Octavius, it's Cleopatra VII he's at war with, and Antonius has just gone native and lost his mind, and isn't it sad? But he's not a real Roman anymore, so totally not a civil war. It's a civil war, folks. It's so a civil war. This brings us to the end of the period we refer to as the crisis of the late Republic. And I'm going to spell out why it's a crisis, because this is a question on the relevant assessment, the midterm. By crisis of the late Republic, we mean that there's an entire century where not one generation of Romans has known a time without multiple civil wars, where every Roman man of fighting age has participated in one way or another in a civil war, and where each generation, for 3 and 4 generations, have had to choose sides, Roman against Roman. And they're doing this while they're also fighting multiple wars of expansion, especially under Caesar, later under Antonius. There's some very unsuccessful ones too under Crassus. Pompey, I'm leaving out Pompey. Sulla has them, Marius has them. So this is a generation that has known nothing but war, wall-to-wall war. the gaps between these years of civil war are not peacetime. These gaps are filled with foreign wars. Imagine if you're, in essence, stuck in a world war situation, or at least a regional war situation, and your father was, and your grandfather, and your great-grandfather. So by the time we get to the end of this period, there's nobody left alive who remembers a functional republic. Here we're talking republic as this elected system of government wherein citizen votes are at the heart of policy, where when you decide who gets to be in charge of a war or what new idea becomes a law, the entire male citizen body of Rome gets together and physically votes on the issue. At the end of this period, that goes away. There are a few early attempts to kind of sort of have some citizen votes, but essentially the only thing you vote on anymore is your representation in the Senate. And senatorial representation doesn't look like it did at the beginning of this century. By the end of the crisis of the late Republic, there aren't enough people from the wealthy families of hereditary power in Rome to run the state. And even in the Italian countryside, there aren't enough families. So we start having families from the provinces, from North Africa, from Gaul, whose children run for the Senate and go to represent their people in it. In some ways, there's wider enfranchisement by the end of this process, but in other ways, things are very different because there's one big elephant in this room. Well, we've already talked about it, so I guess it's not an elephant in the room anymore. That is, by the end of this process, we have a single person who's being consulted on every major matter of business. That is, there's an emperor. Totally not a king, an emperor. But you don't just wake up one day and suddenly have a god emperor. You have to work for it. There's a whole chain of decisions, and for Rome, this is a process that takes a good 2 centuries. By the end of this crisis, we're not done yet. There's still a few things that haven't been decided where Rome could have turned back the clock and stepped away from the precipice. But no, at the end of this, they're tired. They're out of people. And they know, above all other things, they do not want another civil war. And the price of that, they've been led to believe, is an emperor. That's how this happens. Functional democracies don't turn into autocracies, but dysfunctional ones, they do. So let's go down this road with the Romans. Let's see why they made the decisions they made, and let's ask ourselves how they might have chosen differently and how we might do differently in a similar place. Or if we want to. I mean, I don't want to necessarily sell you on the idea that autocracy is always bad. Maybe you can construct a good one. If you're ever God Emperor someday, please don't behead me. I have no money. I cannot be helpful to you. At any rate, that's my introduction. God damn, it managed to be longer than the first introduction. Without any further ado then, the crisis of the late Republic begins!